This is Thursday, October 9th, 2014. We are in Natick, Massachusetts, and this tape is part of the Morse Institute Library's continuing Veterans Oral History Project. My name is Maureen Sullivan. Our cameraman is Dan McDermott of Natick Pegasus. We are privileged to have with us today Liam Walsh. Welcome, Liam.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. May I ask when you were born?
I was born on November 15th, 1982.
And where were you born?
Greenfield, Massachusetts.
And what town do you currently live in?
I currently reside in Somerville, Massachusetts.
Your marital status?
I am single.
And tell us what Greenfield was like growing up.
It was a nice, quiet area to grow up. I enjoyed high school, playing sports, not that big of area, so a lot of friends that you're pretty close with from the elementary school through high school. Looking back, it was a very nice way to grow up. So,
did any members of your family take part in the military?
My grandfather served. He was enlisted prior to World War II, went over to Europe, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and then stayed in at Fort Devens, I believe, for about a decade after the war, and then got out in the mid-50s. And then I have some uncles that did brief stints after high school, but really other than my grandfather, he was the only one who had a sort of military career.
And what year did you graduate high school?
I graduated from high school in 2001.
And where did you graduate?
Graduated from Ralph C. Mahar High School in Orange, Massachusetts.
And I understand you did a year of prep.
Yes, I went to New Mexico Military Institute in Roswell, New Mexico for a year for prep school to go to West Point, and then entered West Point in July of 2002.
Why West Point?
It's a world-class education. I kind of realized that in high school. The leadership development that comes out of the West Point is second to none. I knew that I wanted to serve, so the 5-year obligation for your time in education at West Point wasn't something that really concerned me. So it made sense at the time, and I'm glad it was one of the best decisions of my life to go to West Point.
Tell us what going to West Point was like.
It's demanding. I had done the prep year in New Mexico, which was a military institute, so I was kind of used to balancing academics with military lifestyle, but the academics at West Point were extremely demanding. The structure on your day, from the time you get up at around 5 or 6 in the morning through midnight or later doing homework, every minute of the day is regimented between classes, athletics, military drill and ceremony. So you literally have every second of the day pretty much allocated, which doesn't leave a lot of time for anything other than what West Point has for you. So it gets better as the 4 years go on. You get more privileges and whatnot, but especially the first 2 years were incredibly demanding. The first year, because as they call the freshmen their plebes, you're responsible for all kinds of shenanigans, if you will, to kind of learn how to deal under pressure. And then the second year, actually, I thought the academics were incredibly demanding, probably the hardest year academically for me. So it was definitely challenging, a worthwhile challenge, but challenging nonetheless.
Did you specialize during your years in West Point?
So I majored in military history, actually, which is something that's always interested me. Growing up, as a kid, I liked the Civil War a lot, so military history was always something I enjoyed, and I found it to be a very rewarding experience studying that, especially when I did my senior thesis. I looked at a study of the early U.S. Army involvement in the Vietnam War, and ended up doing a lot of oral history. Interestingly enough, here we are years later, but kind of gained an appreciation through mostly phone interviews, but listening to people tell their stories of this generation prior to what I'd be going into when I graduated in 2006 with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, when you graduated from West Point in 2006.
Yes.
The wars in the Middle East were well underway. Tell us what happened as soon as you got your commission.
So I commissioned and I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, for what at the time the Army was running this, was called Basic Officer Leader Course. It was kind of this short-lived attempt to make all the officers of various branches go to almost a basic training, but not hard getting yelled at basic training, more of regardless of your specialty, everyone learns the same skills. And then I stayed at Fort Benning to do my specialty training as an infantry officer, the infantry officer basic course. So I was at Fort Benning for those 2 courses. I believe that was August 2006 through about January or February 2007. And then upon completing the infantry officer basic course, I went to Ranger School at Fort Benning as well. So I ended up spending almost a year in training at Fort Benning after I graduated from West Point, between the basic officer leader course, the infantry officer basic course, and Ranger School. So that was, for me, my first experience with the Army post West Point, and then went to my first duty assignment, which is at Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Tell us a little more about Ranger School.
Ranger School was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. It's a 62-day course where, if you strip everything away from it, you basically don't eat or sleep for about 62 days while conducting simulated combat operations. And it's really, the Army views it as its premier leadership course. You're not really learning that difficult tactics, but you're having to deal with people that are incredibly tired, hungry. The weather, I was there kind of end of winter and then the beginning of the spring, summer time frame, and you're in pretty bad terrain. So you start at Fort Benning, then you go up to the mountains in North Georgia, and then the last phase you go down to the swamps in the panhandle of Florida. So there's a lot of challenges there, and pretty much everyone reaches their breaking point, and you get selected for leadership positions throughout the course. So you just get your number called, hey, roster number 18, you're the platoon leader now. You have to plan the operation, carry everything out, and you're graded on how well you do in these leadership positions. And then, unlike most other schools in the Army Ranger School, also you're graded by peer evaluations. So even if you pass all of your patrols, at the end of every phase, your squad gets together and they rank everybody in the squad. So if you get peered close to the bottom, if all your peers rate you close to the bottom of your squad, you'll actually get dropped from the course. So it shouldn't, even if you're in great physical condition, but you're not looking out for everyone around you, people see through that, which I thought was a very interesting aspect of Ranger School, because they actually take peer feedback into the criteria for people making it through the course. So I learned a lot about myself, and I think just about human nature during my time there. You realize you're not nearly as tough as you think you are, and everyone has a breaking point. And also that you can get people to get through pretty much anything, working together and applying leadership into that. So,
while you were at Fort Benning and then Fort Campbell, did you ever have a thought in the back of your mind that you might be sent overseas?
Oh yes, it was going back to West Point. I was there. I think it was spring break my freshman year when the war in Iraq started. And it was interesting as a cadet at West Point to initially think, oh, hey, we missed this war, Iraq fell in a month or so, and it was like, oh, we missed this. And then you started to see over the course of 2003 through 2004, 2005, as the situation started to get worse. And then, I will always remember when I was at West Point, whenever a graduate would get killed, they'd make an announcement in the mess hall during breakfast or dinner when we had one of our mandatory meals. And you remember the first time it happened, and then it started happening more and more frequently to the point where it was, at least once a week in the height of the war. So it was interesting, going from being a freshman thinking, oh, we missed the war, because at that time Afghanistan didn't have that much of a U.S. involvement, to graduating in 2006 when it was arguably getting at its worst period, and realizing you're going to go over there. People you had known had already gone over there. Some folks that I had known had gone over there and been killed. So it was this transformation during my time there. So I think that made the training at Fort Benning all the more, you realize you're going to come out of here and as an infantry officer go be a platoon leader. So you need to learn what you're supposed to learn in this training, because there's stories of West Point grads in other branches that don't have as long of a training period. I had friends that, while I was still an infantry officer basic course, they were in Iraq 6 months after graduation. So you realize, that this is very real and likely happening. And then when I got orders to go to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, it was well known that they were going to deploy to Iraq in the summer, fall time frame of 2007. So I knew, when I got done with Ranger School, you'll see some lieutenants at Fort Benning will try to hang around Fort Benning for a while and go to different schools and kind of just mess around for a month or two. I got done with Ranger School and wanted to get to Fort Campbell as quickly as possible to try to get a platoon, to be a platoon leader, and then to, you know, train that unit up prior to going to Iraq.
Now you're at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. It's around 2007?
Yep, I got to Fort Campbell in June 2007.
And you have been assigned to be a platoon leader.
Yep, I was a platoon leader with Delta Company, 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment in the 101st Airborne Division, 2nd Brigade.
So what were your duties?
I was responsible. Delta Company in the 101st Airborne it's actually a weapons company. So you'll have 3 rifle companies and a weapons company. The rifle company platoons are around 40 soldiers. The weapons company platoons are more around 18 soldiers. But at the time, the weapons companies, I believe the structure is still this way, whereas a light infantry unit's built basically on guys with their rifles and what they can carry on their back, the weapons companies were based off of Humvee gun trucks with 50 caliber machine guns or Mark 19s. And they were designed, and then TOW missiles, which is an anti-tank missile system. So the design was, this was the anti-tank company that would augment the other companies in a conventional fight against, you know, the Russians or someone like that when this was designed back in, I think, the late 70s, early 80s. So it was a smaller platoon, and my primary duties and responsibilities were, you know, you're responsible for the health, welfare of all your soldiers, the training and readiness, physical and tactically, of those guys. And, you know, but when I got there in June, it was pretty fast. I got there, we went out to Fort Knox, Kentucky, which is a pretty short drive away from Fort Campbell, to do some platoon level training. Within, I think by August, we went down to Fort Polk for what the Army does as a mission rehearsal exercise at one of the major training centers. So our whole brigade went down to Fort Polk to basically do our validation final training event before going to Iraq.
And where is Fort Polk?
Louisiana, somewhere in Louisiana. So we were down there in August of 2007, which was a pretty hot place. And that was, you know, we were doing counterinsurgency based training, trying to prepare the whole brigade, but, you know, I was focused on my platoon and what we were doing on going to Iraq. So, you know, I got there in June, that took me through September, and then I went to Iraq in October. And there was I think somewhere in there was about a month worth of leave before we went. So I really didn't get to know Fort Campbell too well before I went to Iraq.
During the training, did you receive reports about the Humvees getting nailed by IEDs?
By 2007, they had done a pretty good job at replacing. The non-armored Humvees were completely gone, and then the generational upgrade of the armor packages on the Humvees had gotten better. And, you know, I was in my platoon. The majority of the non-commissioned officers were there in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then they had also gone back in a deployment 2005, 2006, which was they had a pretty rough deployment at that time. A lot of fighting down in the what's called the Triangle of Death south of Baghdad. So you'd heard from these NCOs, you know, kind of the evolution from, you know, speeding into Baghdad in an unarmored vehicle sitting on sandbags to, you know, well, then we had armored vehicles, but they were still getting blown up. So we knew we'd be getting armored Humvees in Iraq when we got there. And then, so I think a lot of those concerns had gone by from, you know, the previous, especially 2003, 2004, early concerns of the invasion when they didn't go with that type of force.
And prior to going to Iraq, did you and your unit receive any training in cultural aspects?
We did. I know my battalion, all the lieutenants actually sat down with a lot of, or I shouldn't say a lot, but they had a few Iraqi expats, and we would do, we call them engagements, but, you know, basically key leader engagements, talking with these Iraqis who would be playing the role of a mayor or a sheikh or a police chief. So the leadership, the platoon leaders actually did that, and it got me, you actually had to experience talking through a translator, you know, some of the cultural norms as far as greeting and handshakes and that you'd experience in Iraq. And then, especially at Fort Polk, it was definitely rotated into the training there. You know, they did their best to replicate civilians on the battlefield And although most of them were, paid American contractors who didn't speak Arabic, they were still, you're having to deal with as you're trying to secure a square or a meeting or something, you're dealing with people that are upset, because the power is not working or because another unit had, run over a dog or killed a child. And so these situations were thrown into the training. And I thought I did a pretty good job of getting us prepared, as much as you could get prepared to go over to Iraq. But, this was 2007 as well. So you had roughly 4 years of trial and error within the Army to kind of figure it out and get it right. So although I don't think anything can ever fully prepare you for what you're going to experience there when you end up ultimately in Baghdad, where I was, I think we did a very good job on preparing, and then also having the experience of a lot of the soldiers who had been there 2 times, at least once. It's interesting when you come in as a new lieutenant. I had never been over before, and then you'd have some brand new privates, but everyone that had been in for at least 2 years had been to Iraq at least once, if not twice. So you got a lot of experience from those guys that had been there and done that before.
All right, you're a lieutenant and you've been deployed to Iraq. Tell us what happened.
So we deployed at the tail end of the surge. You had the 5 brigades surge into Baghdad. So one of the initial challenges was that we call it tactical infrastructure, but the smaller bases that units were living on were it was so crammed because they hadn't had the time to build things up. So initially, our battalion sector was down in northwest Baghdad in a series of neighborhoods around Qadamiyah. But we were originally based out of Camp Taji. My platoon was, which was about 15, 20 miles north of Baghdad. So we'd have to do that drive in and out of town every day. And I started off the deployment. My platoon was tasked to do the the Personal Security Detachment, PSD, for our battalion commander. In olden times, pre-2003, when we didn't fight as much asymmetrically, the way that the Army organized units is, the battalion commander and the sergeant major who are in charge of these organizations, they had their Humvee and they would drive around and go between units, and you could move a vehicle theoretically, fighting a high intensity conflict behind the lines and go between your front lines. Well, in Iraq, that obviously stopped happening. So they had to create, basically a platoon had to move with them because you're not going to be able to drive around with just one truck. So my platoon worked with my battalion commander, and he was very active in going out and engaging with Iraqi Army, Iraqi police officials, his subordinate company commanders, seeing the platoons out there. So we stayed really busy coming down from Camp Taji into Baghdad, back and forth. I think we were keeping a tally when we were based up at Taji in the first few months of the deployment, and we had put on, within 2 months, I think well over 1,000 miles of driving through Baghdad, which, it's 20 miles really. It was, here to Somerville, but we're just going back and forth and through the area so much. And so principally what I would do would be most of the route planning, because we wouldn't want to set predictable routes into where we were going. I do the command and control of our vehicles patrol. So we usually initially we would drive in 3 gun truck patrols. They upped the requirement to make it 4. So we'd move around in about 4 trucks. And as I had mentioned earlier, my platoon being a Delta Company weapons platoon, they actually were familiar with driving Humvees before. So that worked out. They were pretty good at the operational employment of vehicles, whereas some of the rifle infantry companies weren't as good because they just didn't train on vehicles as much. But we went, and a lot of what I would do would be, we would go to neighborhood meetings, and our platoon would set up security around the meeting, and we'd send a few soldiers in to make sure that it was safe where Colonel McLam, my commander, was meeting, but then we'd also pull the outside security. And so it is either between that or just going out and visiting units on patrol. I did that, ultimately, I did the PSD bit I got there in October '07, and I think I switched platoons in June or July of 2008 when we were over there. So it was very rewarding, though, I found, because since I was riding with our battalion commander all the time, I had a much better appreciation for the bigger picture of what was going on in our battalion sector. When I would go and visit my friends that were in Delta Company, the other platoon leaders I had trained up with, they wouldn't have nearly as granular an understanding of what we were trying to do as an organization in partnering with the Iraqi army, with why certain emphases were, this neighborhood versus another neighborhood. And since I was with the battalion commander day in and day out, I got insight into what he was thinking, which is something I've been, I think, blessed for my whole career, because he was an incredibly intelligent officer and a great leader. And I think I learned a lot from just seeing what he did, and how he interacted with soldiers, how he thought through complex problems. But it definitely gave me a much better understanding of this is the big picture of what we're trying to do in our area of Northwest Baghdad, as opposed to later on in the deployment when I moved and took over. I stayed within Delta Company but went to a different platoon. I was concerned with neighborhoods in Baghdad are called mahallas. So there would be small areas, and I was responsible for 3 or 4 mahallas, and that became your world. And you thought that that was the only thing that mattered, was what was right there, and if you only had more resources, you could win the war, and all these great things. And I kind of lost sight of that bigger picture understanding I had when I did the PSD gig with my battalion commander for the first part of the deployment.
And how did you find the locals?
Baghdad was very interesting. I really liked Baghdad. So Northwest Baghdad, where I was predominantly Shia. Our base where we stayed was right outside the Qadimiyya Shrine, which is, I think, the 3rd most holy site in Shia Islam. So it was interesting because that neighborhood, Qadimiyya, a lot of the buildings, you're talking, the shrine was built in 13-something. The buildings were at least 300-400 years old, and it was this maze of just old, narrow streets and alleys that made no sense when you were walking through there with your patrols. And the people, I thought, by 2007, the vast majority of the Iraqis I dealt with in Baghdad had, however bad it was under Saddam Hussein, they had had some semblance of a relatively modern life compared to what I later experienced in Afghanistan. So they knew, by 2007, the common sentiment I would see was, we understand that you Americans aren't here trying to occupy the country. You're here to try to help us. We wish our government would do the same thing and help us help ourselves, because we're just sick of the criminals essentially at this point in time. We're sick of their interference with what we're doing. We want things to be safe. There was a fair amount. If you look at the history of the Iraq War, you have the surge begins in late 2006, early 2007. You have this sharp spike in violence until about September 2007. I got there in October 2007, and then there was this big drop off of violence. So we had we'd look at almost breathing room to work on development projects to try to boost up the local economy. And I thought my experience with the locals I dealt with in Northwest Baghdad, they were pretty grateful that we were there. We would go out on evening patrols and just walk through some of the markets. You get invited into restaurants. They'd go have some food, talk with you, and seemed. I learned a lot of interesting things just walking around talking with people. There was obviously, I think you ran into a lot of, we call military age males, but young unemployed men that would be where you kind of get mean looks, and whether or not they were working for the insurgency or the criminal groups in the area, don't really know. But I think that the vast majority of the folks that we talked with were, I don't want to sound, everything was perfect, but they understood that we were trying to help. And their frustration generally had to do with their own government and their own security forces for not holding up their end of the bargain. That's at least what I experienced talking with people. Maybe they meant other things, but.
While you were on patrol, were you always in full battle gear?
Yes. So the majority of the time when I was, my first half of the deployment, when I was doing the personal security detachment, we spent most time driving around in Humvees, but we were wearing our body armor, our helmet, fireproof gloves, bulletproof eyeglasses, our weapons and whatnot. And you can fit, those are pretty small patrols. The Humvee only sits, driver, TC, you can get 5 people in a Humvee, but the gunner and the driver never get out, so you can only take 3 guys out of it. So if you're moving 4 vehicles, you're only putting, about 9 people, 9 to 12 on the ground. So it's a pretty small organization to be moving through the area. We were in Qadamiyya. I think the population was roughly 500,000 people in this one small nook of Baghdad. So we always wore our protective equipment. Our commander was a pretty big stickler on it. You know, these are the rules. Good units do the right thing because that's what good units do, is kind of one of his, mantras. When I moved to the second platoon leader job I had, we did a lot more. The Mohallas we were in charge were right outside of our base. So we would just walk out the gate a lot and go walk through the community. And we found we did a lot of patrolling in the very early morning hours. 3, 4 o'clock into basically through sunrise, because it would just get hot. And there were days there, I think we hit 125, 130, degrees Fahrenheit, and you're wearing your stuff, it's 70, 80 pounds of equipment. It doesn't breathe well, it's very hot. So that was what, we would go out when we walked. At the same time, when I had shifted over to my second platoon leader job, we had just started fielding the MRAPs, the mine-resisted ambush protected vehicles, so the much larger, essentially what were supposed to be IED-proof vehicles that Secretary Gates had pushed so hard to get to the troops, which were good in a lot of ways in that the ones we had, you could fit so many more people in the back, because we would find tactically, if you're moving a Humvee, you can only fit 3 dismounts in. There's only so many people you could put, say if you're doing a raid on an objective. Whereas with the MRAPs, some of the ones we had, I think you could fit 9 or 10 in the back. So we'd have one platoon drive us out. All our guys would pack in one of these, we call them school buses. They'd drop us off at a place, and then we could do what we needed to do without having to worry about, and they'd leave with the trucks and go do their own thing. So that was, very, it was a big force multiplier, I think, when it comes to the protection that we had with the MRAPs. And that was about, we got them pretty early on. I think within the first few months of coming into country, we started getting MRAPs within our battalion. Because I was doing PSD with my battalion commander, he refused to take MRAPs until the rest of the battalion had been fielded them, because he's like, I don't want to be driving around with these things if my soldiers don't have them. So we were actually the last platoon to go to MRAPs and stayed in Humvees the longest.
And how do you spell that?
It's just MRAP.
Okay.
Yeah. It stands for mine-resistant ambush protected. And they're essentially the large hulking V-Hulk vehicles, and the idea was, you had the flat bottom Humvees, and when you had an IED underneath the ground explode, the flat bottom did not deal with that very well in most cases. The MRAP, since it was higher off the ground with the V shape, it deflected the blast, and they're much heavier, much bigger. One of the challenges we had with them is, and they sit, I think, about 12 feet tall. In a lot of Baghdad, you have very old telephone wires, internet wires running over, and you go driving through, and these things are so high, the turret or the antennas will get caught. So, our soldiers are smart. They would just take PVC piping and make like this guide, we call them. So when you drive through it, just guide the wires over the vehicles, because people would go, they're relying on their TV cables and their internet and power, and you're tearing their wires and their livelihood down. So we didn't have that problem with the Humvees. The MRAPs came and it was like, ooh, this is a problem. They were still an issue where we were at in Baghdad, because a lot of the streets were just so old that you couldn't fit driving in a lot of places. Even the Humvees didn't fit in a lot of the streets. So we got pretty good as far as knowing the area where you could and couldn't go with trucks, where you had to get out, start walking. And when I was in my second platoon leader job, we walked pretty much everywhere we went. But again, that comes at the cost of you're wearing a lot of very heavy, hot equipment. So.
Yeah. So when you were on your first deployment to Baghdad, were you ever in the line of fire?
Yes, we had, that deployment was in our area. As far as kinetic firefight activity, we only had one period in March of 2008. There was, I said earlier, we're in a Shia area, and most of the Shia militias rose up in the end of March 2008 based off of Prime Minister Maliki made a push on a Shia stronghold in southern Baghdad. The Shia militias essentially rose up throughout the country, so our area, they rose up, and there was about a week-long period where it was pretty consistent firefights with these Shia militias. And it's interesting when you look at the composition of those militias, how much of them were criminal, how many of them were Iranian-backed extremists. So there was that period, and then the constant threat that we dealt with our entire deployment was, because that week that we were getting shot at, the U.S. forces never took any casualties that week, but what we had to deal with through the majority of the deployment was the IED threat, and in particular what we dealt with in northwest Baghdad and then in most of eastern Baghdad and most of the Shia enclaves. You had what were called explosively formed penetrators, EFPs, which were they're essentially at least Iranian trained, if not supplied, copper discs, and they'd essentially what it turned into was a shape charge. So you'd pack explosives into a tube, have a concave copper disc on the other side, and when the explosion went off, it would push the copper out and create this copper slug that traveled incredibly fast and would penetrate pretty much any armor that we had. That was one of the issues. The MRAPs were great for underneath, deflecting underneath vehicle explosions, but there was really nothing that we had that could protect against these EFPs. The benefit of it is it's precision munition. It's essentially you're shooting something and it has to hit where people are in a vehicle. So there's a lot of different ways that we could defeat those. There's a lot of technical means that we had as far as preventing the initiation devices, but they also had to be timed pretty perfectly to hit where people were in vehicles. But that was one of the biggest challenges I had that deployment was there was a very, very, very low chance that there were going to be EFPs out there. It wasn't like some areas of the country where there was IEDs everywhere. But when one did go off and you hit a U.S. truck, the results were pretty much always catastrophic on that vehicle. So that was always in the back of your head. We call them TTPs, a tactic, technique, and procedure. When we would drive around and we would go about 5 to 10 miles an hour, because if you don't see this thing, and what they would do is it's kind of this pipe, and then they disguise it in the spray foam, and then make it look like a brick. And there's bricks and rubbish hanging around all over the side of the roads. So you have to just scan. We drive incredibly slow, scanning the sides of the road, looking for these things and possible indicators that they're there. Because if you didn't see one, it was going to be a problem. And there were ebbs and flows throughout the deployment of when the EFP activity was good or bad. Our unit was pretty good at as a battalion of finding EFPs, and we had a lot of locals that would give us tips on these things as well. But the EFP threat was definitely not a fun thing to deal with. And we also went through a period in early 2008 where we dealt with a lot of rocket attacks on our bases, particularly where I was at, FOB Justice in Northwest Baghdad. We had a period, I think it was in April 2008, and you were getting rocketed pretty much every day. We deal with a lot of sandstorms coming in through that time of year, and what the militants realized is a lot of our aerial assets, helicopters, other things we had that could see and quickly respond to rocket launches weren't up there. So they knew that if they launched rockets when it was in a dust storm, pretty much they could get away when they launched the rockets. And they were incredibly accurate I was always surprised because it wasn't like they were using military grade rocket launchers. In a lot of cases it was welded rails that they'd lay the rocket on and initiate it from there, and they're shooting them 10 kilometers away. When I think about the geometry, I was like, wow, these guys are pretty good. Because they were shooting a great distance, and that takes a toll. When we were taking rockets most every day on the base, because you never know, you're sitting there, browsing the internet or whatnot, and then you hear a rocket come in, and when that happens day in and day out, that was pretty harrowing, and it went on for a long time. That was not fun to deal with at all. So.
Did you finally get to deal with the rocket launches? Or?
They more or less stopped, and I think it might have just been it could have been, the weather started getting better. I think a lot of it was, in my opinion, probably after I had talked about the Sadr or the Shia uprisings in late March. I think after they were militarily defeated in that week-long uprising, they kind of then went to the rockets as a counterattack, if you will. whether or not maybe they ran out of rockets. I mean, our battalion and U.S. forces as a whole did a very good job at this time of the war of targeting individual insurgent cell leaders and members. So there were a lot of them that were getting detained on a nightly basis too. So we had done, if we went into to look at some of the targeting we had done of insurgent groups, they had a lot of folks to get detained, and we did a very good. I had talked, popular support we had from the locals, but we did a very good, what we call information operations. Just simple things like we knew who these guys were, so we put up wanted posters all over the place, radio addresses, and when people saw who these guys were, it had two effects. A, we would get tips from the locals if they were around, and B, a lot of these guys had to go to ground per se because they're like, well, they know who I am, they know what I'm doing, I'm gonna have to go across the river, find another place to bed down. So it was, by summer 2008, a lot of the violence had really subsided. We would see occasional upticks in IED activity, but for the most part, by late 2008, when we were getting ready to leave, we had seen most of the violence drop off. And then the other critical aspect of our mission over there was training Iraqi security forces and trying to get them to stand up on their own. And we were doing a much better job on that facet. I mean, that was when I finished the PSD job and moved over to the 2nd platoon I led. We did almost exclusive planning patrolling with the Iraqi National Police that were co-located with us. And you saw that unit get a lot better over the course of the deployment. The Iraqi National Police were historically very corrupt and tied into the Shia militias. And there's reports of they were sent in some areas. They were essentially armed death squads that worked for the Shia militias and would go and eradicate Sunni neighborhoods. So that was what we kind of worried coming in and working with these guys. But they had just switched over the National Police unit we worked with, and I found the National Police Battalion I worked with was their soldiers or policemen weren't the greatest, but they had very good leaders. There was 2 Iraqi majors that I worked with on a pretty much daily basis, and they had both fought the entire Iran-Iraq war for the Iraqi army, so they were very experienced militarily. They understood how things needed to be done. They were very willing to help us. They realized we had certain capabilities they didn't have, but we depended on them, especially in going after and targeting some of these insurgent groups. We needed to have local security forces with us because they could better interact with the population, understand what was going on. And ultimately, for us, it was also proving to the Iraqi people that their own security forces could take care of them and deal with these threats. So the further and further the deployment went on, we started pulling back more and more and letting them do a lot more of the stuff. And we saw by the end of the deployment, the National Police Battalion I worked with, they were going out on their own and finding enemy weapons caches that we wouldn't have known were there, but they would find. You'd see people actually respecting the National Police unit in the area. And I didn't work that much with the Iraqi Army. Other platoons worked with the Iraqi Army in our area, but they shared similar sentiments that people had thought that their security forces had gotten much better. And for us, it was initially in the beginning of the deployment, we would call them partnered operations when you go out with Iraqis. Initially, we wouldn't have to do that. We did a lot of unilateral, so just U.S. patrols. And by mid-2008, we weren't allowed to do unilateral patrols. We had to go out with partners, and I was fortunate where, I would plan these operations with the 2 Iraqi majors. We'd link up with National Police platoon, and we'd just go and patrol areas. And I think it was for a lot of the natives or the residents of the area, they saw, hey, the Americans are patrolling with these guys. Maybe we can trust the National Police because they had such a negative connotation before with them.
Late 2008, when were you sent back to the United States?
Late November, I think, 2008. We were originally scheduled for a 15-month deployment, and then the surge started going well, the drawdown started happening, so we ended up doing about 14 months and came back right before Thanksgiving 2008 was when our brigade came back. We were replaced, and that was one of our goals for our battalion was, hey, we don't want to be replaced. Success is not being replaced by a U.S. force, having this turned over entirely to the Iraqis. We didn't quite succeed in that, but we had come in with a 700-person battalion, and we were replaced by about a 150-person company. So you could see that it started, and then I knew some folks from West Point that were in that unit, and they continued to close down a lot of these bases, because one of the major tenets of the surge in Iraq was moving forces into the population. So getting off the larger bases and we call them either, in Iraq it was either a joint security station or a combat outpost. And these were literally houses that were taken over, barricaded off slightly, and platoons operated out of there. And the unit that followed us, they spent most of their time closing down a lot of these outposts, consolidating and handing over responsibility to the Iraqi security forces.
Before we have you leave Iraq, tell us a little more about life on base.
Okay. I was fortunate. I've resided on 2 major bases when I was in Iraq. I had mentioned before Camp Taji, which is north of Baghdad, which is a pretty huge base. It was a very large Iraqi military base before the invasion, and so there was, I'd say in the realm of at least 10,000 American forces there. The Iraqi Air Force was still running out of there, so their nascent helicopter capabilities were getting trained out of there, and I would call Taji would be one of those super FOBs, if you will. They had Burger King, they had a post exchange. We kind of lived out. One downfall was where our platoon was. The compound was out in the middle of nowhere, so it was actually really difficult because we weren't anywhere close to phones or the internet or Burger King. So they were about a mile or 2 away. But when we were up there, I was doing PSD, and that was essentially, we were on call 24 hours a day. So it wasn't like we could just send guys off, hey, go get Burger King, because if something happened, we would routinely get spun up in the middle of the night because one of our companies had been attacked, and so they had taken some casualties, and the battalion commander wanted to get down there as soon as possible, or they were conducting a raid, or something big happened, and he had to get down there. So we were always on standby. So it meant it was very difficult for us to get our guys over to where there were phones, internet, et cetera, et cetera. We actually, when we were at Taji, it was easier for us when we would drive to one of the company bases in Baghdad, and while we were waiting around while the colonel was meeting with one of the company commanders, our guys would use the internet that they had at one of these smaller bases, and that was easier than it was at Camp Taji. After about 2 months, our battalion moved its headquarters from Camp Taji down to FOB Justice, which was in Kadamia, where I ended up staying the rest of the deployment. FOB Justice had been the center of Iraqi intelligence in Baghdad. It was actually where they hung Saddam Hussein over on the National Police side. So the base is pretty big, and there was a very large Iraqi Army portion, a pretty small U.S. portion, and a very large Iraqi National Police portion. We had roughly, I think, about 500 U.S. on the base, then probably 1,000 each of National Police and Iraqi Army. FOB Justice wasn't bad. A lot of my soldiers, since it was this old Iraqi intelligence building, they actually had, instead of living in tents, they had rooms. They had, 7 or 8 guys in a room, but they might have a sink or a bathroom or something, or a shower in some of the rooms. And they had, in the basement, the U.S. force had put a pretty nice gym down there. And then what we actually had was a lot of locals would come onto the base every day, and they ran little shops where they would sell bootleg DVDs and energy drinks and soap and stuff you'd need like that. So pretty much anything we would need, you could get at FOB Justice. We paid local Iraqis. They we had a bunch of washer machines, so you turn in your laundry, they'd wash it. You bring your ticket, a day or 2 later, you get your laundry back. So it was actually pretty good. The food wasn't bad. I think it was still Army rations that we got, but it seemed pretty good. I enjoyed FOB Justice because it was big enough where it wasn't one of these tiny little remote. We had one of our platoon bases, not in my company, but one of the other companies, and it was maybe 50 meters by 50 meters. It was tiny. It was horrible. I couldn't imagine living there. So they would have to come to FOB Justice, to do their laundry, to get on the internet, to do anything. So it wasn't being on one of these huge bases that you hear about, which I never really liked going to because it's just too much going on, but it wasn't completely tiny. So it was this nice balance in between. And when I ended up doing later on in the deployment, the patrols of the National Police, we just walked out the gate. we were in the neighborhood. If we had, if the dinner that we were having that night was bad, we'd just be like, hey, let's go on patrol and go buy falafels out in the town or whatnot, because, we were there. So,
Well, you mentioned the food. Were you MREs, local food, or?
Mostly we had Army rations that Army cooks prepared, and then they'd have locals help with the serving of it. On operations, one of the missions we had to do that we hated was there was a section of this major highway through Baghdad that had a really bad IED threat. So the entire deployment we had, within our battalion, a platoon was always sitting out there 24 hours a day. So we'd rotate through it. Usually it was 12-hour shifts that you did once or twice a week, and you just sat on a highway for 12 hours and watched traffic and looked for people putting in IEDs. So when you're out there, you're eating MREs. Usually we ate, if we were on FOB Justice, you'd eat what they had there. And the outside outposts had the same thing too. It's not terrible food. And then I ended up eating a lot of local food because I worked for the National Police a lot. Or we'd be at meetings pulling security and just ask, their security guards like, hey, can you go buy us some falafels? Things like that. And then we ended up, we spent a lot of time, we would buy food, just when we were out on patrol from local merchants, because I thought it was better. I got really sick like once or twice, but then I found that once you get sick once, it runs through your system, then you're good to go. So technically, we weren't supposed to eat local food because of the health risks associated with it, but the majority of our guys enjoyed it. And we do it from time to time. It changed things up, but the food wasn't terrible. I mean, when I was in Iraq, we had access to ice cream like every day if you wanted ice cream, because we had freezer storage ability. And one thing that I thought was interesting, in Baghdad, you're really not that far from what was considered Victory Base Complex, the massive U.S. base at the airport. So the resupply was not that difficult. I think, as the crow flies, it was maybe 7 miles away. So we spent a fair amount of time. We'd have to go down to meetings because our brigade was based out of there. So we'd have to go down to, we call it VBC, Victory Base Complex. So either there or the Green Zone, maybe once or twice a month. And guys liked that because then they could go to the post exchange there, which you could buy a big screen TV there if you wanted to. It was insane. But they could go get their Burger King. They could buy, real cigarettes or whatnot instead of, the cheap ones that they would get, Pall Mall or whatever knockoff brand the Iraqis had. Just like, I don't think these are real cigarettes. So it was, I think quality of life wise, it wasn't that bad. FOB Justice, we had a fair amount of phones and internet. And then you'll find our communication guys had set it up where we actually had either wired or wireless network that you had to pay for. But they would run it through, a British contractor or something where you could get internet in your room. It would cost you, $100, $150 a month, but it was better than going to go wait for one of the 7 or 8 computers that we had, and it wasn't that bad. So that was nice. I was able to keep in touch with home and everything like that.
That's good. Let's get back to the United States just before Thanksgiving. Are you back at Fort Campbell?
Yep, I went back to Fort Campbell. Shortly after we returned, around Christmas time, we went on a long period of block leave, and then when I came back from block leave, I changed jobs and became the executive officer for our headquarters company. So my job primarily consisted of all of our equipment had been, sent through Kuwait on ships, and it was receiving all the equipment, making sure it all made back, accounting for everything, figuring out what was broken. It was very tedious, long work, not fun. The executive officer is not a rewarding job at all. It's a ton of work, but nobody really knows if you're doing your job unless you start messing things up, and then people know. So you're technically second in command of the company, but all you really worry about is property.
And at this point, are you a first lieutenant or still a second?
Oh, I got promoted to first lieutenant pretty early on, within a month of getting to Iraq, because we get promoted first lieutenants in automatic at 18 months, I think. So shortly after I got to Iraq, I got promoted to first lieutenant, and then mid-June, I think, after we came back, so in 2009, I got promoted to captain when I was an executive officer. Back then, we were promoting pretty quick to captain because of the war. I think of 35, 36 months is what I got promoted at from time of commission.
That is fast.
Yeah.
You're accounting equipment at Fort Campbell. Tell us what happened next.
So I came on orders. The next thing in an infantry officer's career is to go to what's called the Maneuver Captain's Career Course. So back to sunny Fort Benning, Georgia again. and it's a 6-month course in basically the things you need to know to be a company commander, and then also a battalion staff officer. And so, when we came back from Iraq, I had a lot of very good friends and the other lieutenants. We had a lot of really good times, very close social networks. And fortunately, a lot of us went down to Fort Benning at the same time. So we were able to carry that forward when we went down to the career course at Fort Benning. And then also the career course at Fort Benning wasn't that demanding time-wise. So we had a fair amount of time to relax and do what you needed to do. For the 6 months that we were down there, I learned a great deal about how to be a company commander, whether it's operational planning or logistics, and then some of the less glorious stuff about planning battalion operations and logistics, maintenance, things like that. But it was a very it was a worthwhile 6-month period that I had at Fort Benning for the career course.
Now we are going to 2009. You
Yep.
finished at Fort Benning. Tell us what happened next.
So I finished down the career course, I think early 2010, February 2010. Early on in the career course, our branch manager for infantry branch came down and interviewed to find out where you wanted to go next. Hey, these are the slots that are available. The Army, when it manages infantry officers, you either have light infantry units like the 101st Airborne or the 82nd Airborne, units that essentially are non-vehicle based. Granted, in Iraq or Afghanistan, everyone was using Humvees and MRAPs, but doctrinally they are not based off of vehicles. The other side is mechanized infantry. So you think of Bradley fighting vehicles or Stryker infantry carrying vehicles. So if you were in a light unit, basically you have to go to a heavy or mechanized unit your second assignment, or vice versa. If you're in a heavy unit, you go to a light unit. So I talked with my branch manager, who is responsible for putting your next assignment. I wanted to go to a Stryker infantry unit. The organization of the Strykers, it's an 8-wheeled vehicle that carries 9 infantrymen. The vehicles can travel upwards of 65, 70 miles an hour. It's a pretty, the Strykers came in, I believe, in about 2001. And for me, if I had to go to a motorized or mechanized unit, I wanted to go to Strykers versus Bradleys. Bradleys is almost like a tank. You still have guys in the back of a Bradley, but the Stryker just always appealed to me. So I requested to go primarily to Stryker posts, and fortunately was able to get my top choice of duty assignment, which is at Fort Lewis, Washington, with a Stryker brigade there. So I found that out probably November 2009, and then in February or March 2010, I did what we call a PCS, a permanent change of station, across the country from Fort Benning up to Fort Lewis, Washington.
Your first time on the West Coast.
It was a fun drive across the country, and
you drove?
I had to move the Army moved most of my things, and then I drove across the country, and then I knew the unit that I was going to was already deployed in Afghanistan. They had deployed in late 2009, so I was trying to get there. They were going to redeploy in July 2010, so I wanted to get there as early as I can and try to catch the end of that Afghan deployment with the unit. So I ended up getting to Fort Lewis in early March 2010, and by late March, I think I was there for 2 weeks before I was in Afghanistan, joining the unit who had already been there for 8 months. So I left with a bunch of, I can't remember how many of us there were, but there was a fair amount of soldiers and officers that were going, deploying late to augment people that had to come back or whatever the case might be. So I went through Kandahar Airfield, spent some time there, and found out I was going to be assigned with 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment, which was out in the Maiwan district, west of Kandahar City. So kind of between Kandahar City and Helmand, out in the no man's land along Highway 1 out there was where we were. And I got assigned out there as an assistant operations officer. So for those 4 months, I essentially worked in a tent from about 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And as fate would have it, I showed up, and my boss at the time, Major Carlson, now Lieutenant Colonel Carlson, was like, "Oh great, I have another captain. You can plan the redeployment to get us back to the United States." So I had just come from the United States, and I was planning to get this unit back to the United States. So for me personally, I left on patrol just because my boss wanted us to get out from time to time, maybe 4 times in those 4 months. And normally, it was the 9 to 9 operational planning, thinking about getting equipment back to the United States, thinking about how we were going to be replaced with the incoming unit, because interestingly enough, my old unit from the 101st was actually coming to replace us in Afghanistan, because this was the beginning of the Afghan surge. So whereas when we left Iraq, battalions were replaced with companies, we were in the exact opposite, where companies were getting replaced with battalions with brigades. So the massive upsurge was happening. So we had a plan, hey, how are we going to get us out of here, get them in, get them to take over the area? And although for me that deployment wasn't very bad, for the area our battalion is at, it was very, we call kinetic, and there was a lot of enemy activity where they were at. So it was kind of weird for me, you're sitting in an air-conditioned tent, working on a computer, planning the movement of containers to Oman, to get your stuff back to the United States. And then the guys that are out there at the outposts, they're in contact with Taliban day in and day out. So, we like to say in the Army, no good plan survives first contact. And I came up with this wonderful wizard plan for how we were going to get everybody, and they were all going to fly from their bases to Kandahar and get on airplanes. And then, the first day when we were putting helicopters down to pick guys up at one of the outposts, they started taking, mortar fire where the helicopters were landing. So it's like, well, this plan isn't going to work. So, I had to come up with this, my well-laid plans for 3 months had gone and fallen apart within, 12 hours of implementation. So we, had to come up with things. But that was an interesting deployment for me, just because it's this idea, you're still an infantry battalion, but not everybody's fighting and doing things. I'm sitting in a tent and working 12 hours a day.
What had you been told about Afghanistan before you got there?
Well, the unit I went to, at the time it was 5th Stryker Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division. They were the first Army Stryker Brigade to go to Afghanistan. And they were originally scheduled to go to Iraq, and then they got redirected to Afghanistan pretty late in their training cycle. And when they were in Afghanistan, there was not a lot of U.S. forces in southern Afghanistan. And they had a very difficult, they took a lot of casualties the first few months there. They had a very steep learning curve, because they went on some offensive operations into areas no one had been in years. And the Taliban in the area was ready for them. And we had one battalion lose, I think upwards of, within the first 2 months, 20 soldiers killed in action. So, I had known that there was things in the Army Times publication that was written about how horrible this deployment was. So when I found out that I was going to that unit, I was like, oh, this could be interesting. But I knew that they had had issues. The Stryker platform, similar when we talked to the Humvees, the Stryker was also a flat-bottom vehicle, and they had performed pretty well in Iraq. But when they went to Afghanistan, they were hitting massive IEDs. There was one instance in our brigade before I got there where, a Stryker got hit, all 7 soldiers inside were killed, because there's this flat bottom that wasn't designed for that. Interestingly, if you fast forward to my most recent deployment, they had retrofitted the Strykers, which was called the double V-hole. So even though it looked the same, the way that they had redone the inside, it upgraded the armor package on the bottom to prevent against these type of strikes. But at the time, that wasn't there. So it was a very interesting deployment, the first one in Afghanistan, because the Regional Command South headquarters that ran the area operations it was still a British headquarters. The Unit 2, our east, was Canadian. You had Marines to our west. I think it was Norwegian to the north. So it was very multinational, NATO-esque, and there was a lot of, I think, unity of command issues. Their U.S. forces knew that this upsweep was coming of U.S. forces when the surge began, but it hadn't really started yet. And my take when I first got to Kandahar was kind of like, wow, this is kind of a mess compared to what I had experienced in Iraq. I remember vividly when we were at Kandahar Airfield doing some of our, there's a battery of training you have to do once you get into country. They'll give you very recent IED examples and things like that. So you'll go through these training exercises, and I was on this little shuttle bus out to the training lane with some of the lieutenants that had come out with me, and they're like, "Sir, is that the outside of the base?" I'm like, "No, there's no way. It's a chain link fence. This is Kandahar Airfield." Because in Iraq, we had these massive concrete blast walls, And lo and behold, the chain link fence at the time was the perimeter of Kandahar Airfield. It's like, wow, take me back on that one. So it was a very different experience than what I had realized in Iraq. And at the time, 2009, 2010, it was a different war, I think, than what we saw in 2010, 2011 in Afghanistan, as the surge started happening there, because it was just very resource constrained in 2010. There were still a lot more forces in Iraq than there were in Afghanistan. So it was a very interesting, short but interesting deployment for me.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you there in your first deployment?
My first deployment in Afghanistan, I was only there for 4 months. So compared to the 14 I had done in Iraq, it was, well, this is pretty easy. And then we came back from Afghanistan, and I spent about a year in the same job as an assistant S3. And once we get back to Fort Lewis, when units come back from deployments, most of the people that have been there for a while, they move to another assignment. You get a bunch of new people in. So I was responsible for planning and coordinating all the training that the battalion did for about the next year, from July 2010 until March 2011. And in March 2011, I took command of a Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment. So became a Stryker Rifle Company commander in March 2011.
Tell us what happened next.
So we knew we would be going back to Afghanistan. The Army had just recently, you often hear people talk about dwell time and how long people have between deployments. We knew that because the commitments in Iraq were going away, we were going to have about 2 years of dwell time. So that gave me about a year from the time I took command to the time I knew we'd be going to Afghanistan. So we trained, we did a lot of training. I took command. One of the challenges with Fort Lewis is that the training area there is not very conducive to motorized vehicle training. So we actually would have to drive 6 hours out to Yakima Training Center east of the Cascade Mountains, which is this desert. It actually replicates Afghanistan pretty well. So we'd go out there routinely. I believe right after I took command, we went out there for about a 2-week exercise. Later in the summer, we went out there for a month. So I would balance basically between doing the training of our soldiers in individual tasks and small unit tasks, and then we do these larger exercises out at Yakima. And then in November 2011, similar to when I went to Fort Polk when I was the 101st, we went to Fort Irwin, California, which is the National Training Center, similar mission of Fort Polk, Louisiana. Just it's a desert out, it's out in the Mojave Desert. So we went there to do our mission rehearsal exercise for Afghanistan. And this time as a company commander, I was responsible for, our training focus was on, hey, we're going to Afghanistan, this is what we need to do to get ready. At that time, I think we thought we were going to go to Afghanistan in like February, so about 2 or 3 months after that, the National Training Center rotation. But we went out to the National Training Center, trained on multiple things. I found the training, one of the major qualms I had with this rotation is that we knew we were going to have to be working with and training Afghan Army or Afghan police, and it was just something that wasn't able to be very well replicated. And I felt that this late in the war, we know this is what we're doing. This should be a focal point of what we're training. And I understand we're not going to have an actual Afghan platoon to train with, but even with U.S. role players, I found it was kind of very limited in its scope, and it was kind of frustrating because I knew what our guys were going to be going into in Afghanistan when it came based off my experiences working with the National Police in Iraq, and I had known that the 2010 deployment, most of them didn't really work with the Afghan Army because it really was almost non-existent. So working with host nation security forces is going to be important, and I felt like we really kind of didn't get that out of the National Training Center. The other thing that was missing was the area we were going into in Afghanistan was inundated with these combat outposts. So, essentially every platoon in your company was living on its own outpost. And when we were at the National Training Center, our whole battalion was on one base. So these platoon leaders never got the experience of, hey, I have to think through the defense plan of my little base here, let alone the ideas that, the simple things that would haunt us when we went back to Afghanistan, like, paying contracts to keep the people that come to deal with the porta-johns and the food and everything like that. Because when you're a new platoon leader. I couldn't have imagined doing it. I didn't have to deal with it in Iraq, but when we went to Afghanistan in 2012, they all had their own, small combat outposts that you're responsible for multiple facets, and we weren't able to replicate that at all at the National Training Center, which I thought was kind of frustrating. And I understand, you're in a resource-constrained environment, but I felt, we could have done a better job as a unit because we knew what we were getting into, and I don't think did a great job tailoring our training to what we knew we were coming in on. So we learned a lot out of the rotation, but I think there were definitely some things that we missed going that would have helped for Afghanistan.
And when were you sent back?
In late March or I think it was early April 2012, our battalion went to the Arghandab River Valley, which is just north of Kandahar City, slightly northeast of where I was the first time in Afghanistan. And this was interesting. When I had talked about when our unit was over there in 2009, 2010, and that unit had taken a lot of casualties, one of our sister battalions, my company, Bravo Company, had been attached to that battalion. So a lot of our guys had been to the Arghandab before and had this very negative connotation of how horrible it was in 2009. So there was some consternation with a lot of our veterans because they were like, I don't like, going back to that place. I was there before. It was really bad fighting. This is not good. Interestingly, we got there, and the unit there before us had done a great job, and it was quiet. I mean, there was not much going on for enemy activity at all. What I found to be the case is it was more dealing with tribal and village infighting and politics. Really two sides, maybe three sides of my job as a company commander, at least initially in Afghanistan, were balancing and playing mediator in these tribal fights and squabbles or village squabbles that were going on, mentoring and training the Afghan army, but also getting them to stop being dependent on U.S. supplies, which they had been for years. And then the third leg would be, kind of keeping our guys afloat, because we were initially, when my company came into the Arghandab, we were responsible for 5 combat outposts. So my company headquarters was there with a platoon on 1, but for those other 4, they were running their own combat outpost. And even the senior non-commissioned officers had never been through this experience before, and it was little stupid things. It was making sure that you did the contracts correctly to pay the guys that come and deal with your sanitation, because there'd be local contractors that would do that stuff. Our guys went through crash courses to get legally qualified as contracting officers, but they weren't really prepared for how to deal with little stuff like that. Making sure that you ordered your food properly, so you didn't come into we're out of food today and it's not coming until next week. This, and then obviously, you're on these small bases. You have to plan for force protection. So you've got say 4 guard towers, and you'd say most of these bases were roughly 30 U.S. soldiers, maybe 30 Afghans. Well, it always took about 9 to 10 guys to man the guard towers and the gates and everything. You'd have another 9 to 10 that were out patrolling, and so that leaves 9 to 10 that are back actually getting rest. So the operational cycle that they were on was incredibly demanding initially when we came into country. So it was this, for me, it was exhausting, listening to a lot of this, what I found to be frankly, semantic squabbling between these village elders over stuff that, went back decades, and, long family feuds, and so-and-so did this with the Mujahideen, and that's why we'll never like him, and trying to do that, dealing with Afghan security forces that were less than pleased that we weren't giving them gas anymore and things like that, because they had, for the previous few years, the U.S. had given them pretty much anything they wanted. Oh, you guys need air conditioners for your tent? Sure. Gas? Sure. Here's no problem, because we had to get them into the fight. And then in 2012, we're getting ready to leave. The 2014's on the horizon, and hey, these guys need to come up with what we refer to as Afghan sustainable solutions. Can they really sustain air conditioning in their tents when we pull out and our generators go away? No, they can't. Can we continue to give them however many liters of gas a month? No, we can't, because they actually have a system. From Ministry of Defense, the gas and everything's actually there somewhere high up, but as it goes down the chain, it gets siphoned off here, there, everywhere else. So then when it comes down, to poor Lieutenant Aziz or whoever, He's like, well, my truck has no gas. We can't go on patrol. And it's like, well, maybe we'll walk. And then they'll try to come up with an excuse. So it was very difficult in ways I didn't imagine because, as I had mentioned, it wasn't a very hostile or kinetic deployment. We dealt with, there was, in the northern area of the sector, there was a fair amount of, there were some places where there was a fair amount of enemy activity, but nothing like they had seen in 2010. And the Arghandab district was started to be looked at as this great success story because in 2010, 2011, it was probably one of the worst places in Afghanistan. And then it had become this case study of, oh wow, counterinsurgency worked here, and why is the Arghandab different, and why is it working? So it was rewarding, but it was also a really frustrating first few months of the deployment. And then as the drawdown was going on, we continually would be moving forces, so we kept changing bases. And originally I was my force was all on the northern side of the district, and then we moved to all the western side of the river. So you'd have to uproot, move, get to learn new Afghan counterparts, new village elders. So it was hard, I thought, to make lasting relations with village elders, with Afghan partners, and it was also tough just continuously moving a fair deal of the time and learning. A lot of these villages, there was a great deal of you had to have a basic understanding of the history of the power players in them if you wanted to be effective and know what some of their motives were because of what had happened 2, 3, 15 years ago, and realize that this guy is always going to be striving, to screw over this other guy that he hates because they took his water rights or something along those lines. So it was I thought, a very academic, much more so than I expected, exercise, and have an understanding of anthropology in some regards, of understanding how these tribes worked and why this tribe hated this tribe, and it was very challenging. And then there was, trying to reduce our support to the Afghan security forces, but also have them go out and do more on their own. And I had some great Afghan army counterparts that U.S. forces would pull out of their base, they'd be left behind, and they stayed incredibly effective. Very professionally, did a great job. The areas that they were responsible for really respected the work that they did. But then I also worked with the national police, their Afghan national police, and also the Afghan local police, and then you have this full gamut of reactions. You see a lot of the policemen were very, what we would call corrupt. They don't see it as being as corrupt as we would consider in America if the police just stopped you on the road and demanded money. It's somewhat acceptable in Afghanistan, but they're at a certain level, they would cross the line, and then the people would get upset. So it was frustrating for me because you want to go over there and help, but at that point in the war, we pretty much stopped doing construction and development projects. So you're only able to do so much. Had it been 2 or 3 years earlier, hey, we're working with the district council and we're gonna, build a bridge here or a well here. We stopped doing that stuff. So you had a lot of people. The sentiment that I experienced with a lot of the Afghans at that point were kind of like, well, what are you guys really doing here then? And I was like, well, we're trying to train the Afghan army, but it was difficult because you wanted to help, but you were extremely limited in what we could do because of the resource constraints by the end. So.
And how long were you on your second deployment?
So my second deployment was a 9-month deployment. I came over in April. In November, I took command of the battalion's headquarters company, which was a whole different set of challenges. So I went from being what we call a battle space owner, someone that actually is responsible for an area of the district and the security and the mentorship. In November, I took command of a second company, the battalion's headquarters company. So I was at the battalion headquarters, which is co-located with the district government center, with the district police center, and with the Afghan Army Battalion headquarters. So I didn't have anybody in we call it a headquarters company, HHC. And HHC, I didn't really have any platoons that went out and did things for me. I had a scout platoon, but they worked for the battalion and did what the battalion told them to do as far as focused targeting. So me and my first sergeant's job was to run this monstrosity that was the district's police center, where you had I think we had about 150, 180 Americans there, about 300 national police, 300 Afghan army, plus the district government center, and nobody there liked each other very much.
Oh,
I I had very good experience working with, when I was on the other side of the river with Bravo Company. In the summer 2012 across Afghanistan, there was this really big problem with what's called green on blue, where you had Afghan security forces killing Americans. Whether they were Taliban infiltrators or it was a personal feud, it differs from case to case, but it led to a lot of changes in how we did business. I used to routinely go to the other side of my compound and meet with the Afghan company commander of their police unit just by myself, no weapon or anything like that. And, it eventually got to the point where, you cannot meet with the Afghans until we implemented, they've done all these background checks on all their soldiers. And it was unfortunate, because we ended up, throwing up barriers where we used to have tents next to each other where we lived. We had to build barriers. And I was blessed at where I was when that first happened to have, although I was there with both Afghan police and Afghan army units, the commanders were very mature. And, when I called them in and had to tell them, hey, this is what's happening, they're like, hey, we watch TV. We know what's happening. We know this isn't your decision. And the other thing I was fortunate with there is that the army and the police weren't huge fans of each other. So we gave the police their own compound, the army their own compound. And since they didn't have to deal with each other anymore, they thought it was the greatest thing ever. They're like, oh, the Afghan army guys weren't laying on the grass talking on their cell phones all night. This is great. They stayed to themselves. So we had a very good, as best relationship we could have to overcome these challenges of, hey, I trust you guys, and I don't think any of your soldiers are going to kill my soldiers, but this is what's happened in the country. When I went to the headquarters company, that was not exactly the mentality there. There was a lot of ill will between the Americans and the Afghan police there. I don't know all the history behind it, but we actually had, before I went there, Afghan police officer had sexually assaulted a female American soldier there at the gates. Just bad things were happening. There were verbal altercations, physical altercations. And so you're looking through this lens of, you see what's happening throughout the country, and this place is prime for something like this to happen. So me and my first sergeant had to work a lot with trying to manage just tensions there and, make sure that we could coexist with the police. Because again, this went back to, we were no longer giving them resources. So when we used to be giving them resources and let them do this, that, and the other thing, they didn't mind so much. But now that we were, in a lot of shapes, squatters on their base because we weren't doing as much, supporting them was kind of their site, or the way that they saw it, it became a very big challenge managing those relationships because, our battalion commander would have a good relationship with their battalion commander. And, everything was great between the two of them. But then when you dealt with the interactions with the soldiers, it was too small of an area for that many people to be together of different culture. It was one of the bigger challenges I've had in my time as an officer, period, because there were just not good solutions. And I had come from a place where we had been able to work relationships and coexist very well, and it was frustrating to not be able to really make it happen over there. So I only spent about 2 months, because we ended up redeploying in January 2013. So I only spent about 2.5 months over there at the District Police Center, but it was a very tense 2 to 3 months. And it was just a small base that, because the district center was there, that's where it had to be. And it was on the side of this mountain, and it was not very defensible. Then you have a bunch of, it was all the battalion headquarters soldiers who do all the mundane, the personal administrative and the communications and the intelligence stuff. They're the unsung heroes of the unit. So in a lot of cases, their morale was kind of low. So keeping those guys, involved and not getting too down on themselves. And one of the big things me and my first sergeant did is we made a huge deal out of Thanksgiving and made it, into this pretty big, almost, celebration where we had a small shooting range. We had a turkey shoot, target competition up there, basketball tournament, boxing tournament, a huge meal, and tried to give all the guys and girls that were on the base an opportunity to kind of relax and, unwind, because it was both between us and the Afghans. Then I think just internally with the U.S. force there, it was a tense situation, because I think when you put soldiers on a small base, there's only 30 of them, and they're going out and they're patrolling every day. They see purpose in what they're doing, whereas these guys are working in an office and they're processing paperwork and they're getting mail and they're doing all the stuff that nobody cares about unless it goes wrong. So I know it was difficult for the staff soldiers to go through that. So that took us through our redeployment in roughly January 2013. I think it was one of the last ones out when we left in 2013.
And where were you sent?
I went back to Fort Lewis, Washington, and I had been at that for about the previous 6 months. I'd been looking for what I was going to do when I finished up company command. So I had done a retention incentive program when I was at West Point, where instead of doing the standard 5-year commitment, I agreed to do an 8-year commitment. But at the caveat on that was at the completion of my company command, if I still want to stay in the Army would send me to any grad school I could get into. So while I was in Afghanistan, I was applying to grad schools. I ended up applying to several schools, got into the Fletcher School at Tufts, and decided that was really where I wanted to go. And they were great because they had early notifications. I found out in November when I was in Afghanistan that I had gotten in, which was nice. So we came back to Fort Lewis, and the same process is all, a lot of soldiers started leaving, going to other bases, new soldiers came in, and you just start going through that cycle of, training new soldiers on individual tasks and start building up to collective tasks. So we spent that summer, the ROTC did their annual summer training at Fort Lewis for decades, so we got tasked for about a month and a half to support that and run the land navigation lanes for the cadets and do some other things. But we just went back to the normal training cycle until I ended up leaving in August 2013 to come out here to the Boston area to go to grad school at Fletcher. So, and then I've been there for the last year now.
And what are you majoring in?
I'll get a master's degree in law and diplomacy, but I focus on security studies and international negotiation and conflict resolution. So it's a great program. I enjoy kind of the break from the Army. I miss a lot of the aspects of the Army, but it's nice to, it's such a great program with such an international dimension of student body that you get to meet people from all over the world with different viewpoints and have the time to actually think through, what I've done with Iraq and Afghanistan and over the last, 8+ years now to have some time to think about, well, how does this fit into the big picture geostrategically of what we're doing and what's going on?
And are you still in active service with the Army?
I'm still active duty, yes. So I'll owe them a long time for grad school since they're paying for me to go to grad school. I intend to keep it a career at this point in time, so it doesn't bother me. I like the Army. I want to keep doing this. And I figure, have the opportunity to kind of be out of the Army for 2 years, go to grad school. My family's close by, so I can see my mom, my brother, my niece. It's a nice change of pace. I'll graduate this upcoming May, and then I'll go to Army Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So it'll be about, with the 2 years at Tufts and then another year at Fort Leavenworth, it's kind of a long time away from the Army, or at least the operational Army, before I move on to wherever my next assignment after that will be. So.
And of course, I've in speaking with some of fellow Iraq, Afghanistan veterans, they've been talking about the first thing they realized when they got home, they could see green again.
Yep. Now, coming home is always tricky, I think. I personally, I had a tough time coming back from Iraq. It was just, you spend 14 months someplace else where you're doing life and death decisions day in and day out. And then when you come back, there's a lot of trivialness in, day-to-day life. Even as an active duty Army soldier, it was always, frustrating. For instance, as a platoon leader, you're able to take out 18 soldiers and go patrol and, risk your lives and, possibly get killed. And then you come back and you can't run a rifle range where nobody's moving. You're just standing there and shoot. You need to have a captain or somebody running, So this, the loss of almost autonomy, it's difficult to deal with. And then I think at a more internal level, I felt, at least in Iraq, that each and every day we made a difference in what we were doing there. And then you come back and it's like, you're not making or at least you don't feel like you're making the same amount of difference. I mean, it's frustrating for me to see, what's happening in Iraq now, because I will go to my grave feeling that what we did made a difference at the time and made it a better place for, the people in Northwest Baghdad. And to see what's happening now, it's definitely frustrating. But yeah, I mean, it goes into coming back and all of a sudden you can drive, and you haven't done that in 14 months. It's a long time. So the 2 Afghan deployments, the only being 4 and 9 months. 9 months I thought was about a perfect length for a deployment, because you had enough time to get in, to really get to know the area, and then to have a good understanding of what was going on, but then you start leaving right around the time when it starts turning into Groundhog's Day. Whereas, you do 14 months, you start hitting the same holidays twice. You're like, oh, we've been here for a year. We're going to be here for another 5 months. It's a long time. So that was definitely tricky.
Being a Massachusetts native, of course, I take it you've gotten the bonus.
I have, yep.
And what do you think about the veterans programs in Massachusetts?
I think they're very good. Massachusetts is always somewhat tricky, I think, when it comes to veteran stuff, because it is a pretty small portion of the population, especially in these wars, that is served. And it's important, I think, that we keep veterans, particularly of Iraq and Afghanistan, connected to their communities when they come back. I think there's a lot of misinformation that exists out there whenever you see something happen with veterans that go off the deep end, and there's this quick rush to paint, well, everyone that went to Iraq and Afghanistan has PTSD or the like. And it's unfortunate because the vast majority of people don't, and if they do, they deal with it very well. But I worry, I see it in an area like Somerville, there's just not a lot of Iraq and Afghanistan vets. There's a fair amount, Vietnam, Korea, not so much World War II, but it's difficult for the younger generation to kind of, integrate with that veteran community. And that's why it's important, I think, for the veterans community to have organizations. One of the organizations that I spend a fair amount of time with out in Boston is my shameless plug for Team Red, White, and Blue is centered around enriching the lives of veterans through physical activity and social ties. So we'll do a lot of 5Ks, runs in Boston. It's a nationwide group, but it's good because it's an area where, say I had come back from Iraq the first time and chose to gut out and lived in Somerville, and I don't know any other veterans. I even, as a captain in grad school, had a difficult time because all of a sudden you don't have people that have been through like experiences that you can talk with and really understand. So that's why I think it's important to have organizations like Team RWB that try to bring veterans together, but also get them tied to their community. One of the things I've always found impressive with Team RWB is there's a fair amount of never have served, civilians from the community that just want to be involved and try to help. And that's very important because if we don't do that, you run the risk of people, going to the far extreme. The stats are, I think, 22 veterans a day commit suicide, and that's a national tragedy. But Boston, especially Boston's got some great organizations. I mean, the Red Sox Foundation and MGH have the Home Base Program, which is a great program that provides treatment for those with traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and the like, free of charge to those returning members. I know some former service members that use those facilities and those services and say it's an absolutely great program to have. So, I mean, I'm proud to be a Massachusetts veteran. But I do think it's a smaller community than some states.
Liam, given your future plans, do you think you're going to be deployed to the Middle East again?
I don't. I say that optimistically and hoping that we don't wind up back there. It's the last several months have been a little different than I think we thought they were going to play out. So I'm optimistic, and I say, when I left Afghanistan the last time, it was weird. I was like, wow, I don't think I'm ever going to be coming back here again. And for a while, that seemed inconceivable. I optimistically say, hopefully not, but it's possible. Will it be in a role like what I've experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan? Hopefully not. Maybe in a train and assist role, like what we're seeing with the limited use of division headquarters elements in Iraq right now and the like. But I'm optimistic when I say hopefully not. I think that, I don't know, we'll see. I hope not.
Well, Liam Walsh, we thank you so much for coming and taking part in the Natick Veterans Oral History Project.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.